Welcome to the final session of opportunities. We've saved the best for last. As we close this series, we'll dare to believe that God will use you and I to minister to influential people. This can be intimidating, but it's exactly the kind of thing God has done throughout history. I don't believe I've experienced this kind of ministry as much as I've watched as God has used others to do this. Here's one incident that comes to mind, though. There's an adage that says, speak truth to power. And that's easier said than done. By nature, speaking to someone of power or influence is intimidating. To be safe, many of us probably find ourselves taking a pass and when given a chance to talk to people of influence. When I was in 8th grade, my mother showed me how to push past fears and speak up when the situation warrants. When I came home with a new book assignment for English literature, she was concerned. The book was famous, but it had some content that she didn't really feel appropriate for kids my age. In those days, most parents had a high respect for school officials, and it wasn't common to make waves. But after prayer, my mother felt she needed to do something. Now, I wasn't aware of all that transpired over the next few weeks, but I know she made an appointment to talk with my teacher. She explained that the book was inappropriate, and she asked that I be given an alternate assignment. Come to find out, several other parents had also expressed concern, and the teacher granted their requests and assigned a different book. To be honest, I was a little embarrassed at the time. Not till I grew older did I realize how brave my mother had been. But the story didn't end there. When being lovingly confronted by several Christian parents, the teacher was evidently being introduced to people of strong faith for the first time. We later came to find out that incident motivated him to begin attending a church. It appears that he was led into some kind of relationship with Jesus, all because of a few homemakers who cared enough to speak up against inappropriate school assignments. More recently, during the COVID-19 pandemic, some government officials took the extreme measure of shutting down churches even when many other gatherings were not shut down. Some pastors rose up to speak to people of influence and point out the inconsistency. Eventually, the matter came before the U.S. Supreme Court. Thankfully, the court ruled in favor of churches. So as a result of somebody asking judges for fairness, millions of churchgoers were protected from future overreaching officials. The process of speaking truth to power was expensive and costly for the pastor and church who saw this matter through to the nation's highest court, but every church won as a result. Churches were able to resume services, judges could be proud of defending freedom, and overreaching government officials were reminded how they should treat people who believe in freedom. In reality, many times speaking to power doesn't yield such positive results. Sometimes those who are doing the right thing seem to lose the battle. But when good people give people in power the opportunity to do the right thing and lose, they've still done a good thing. Others are encouraged to stand for their faith. Heaven watches. If no one had stood up, there would have been nothing good that came of it. Are you willing to pay a price to help someone else do the right thing? It could be an opportunity to change many lives. Perhaps as we stop to discuss and pray about this topic, God will prepare our hearts so we'll have the necessary courage should God give us opportunities to minister to people of influence. In this section of this final session of opportunities, we'll consider Acts chapters 19 through 28. These chapters describe Paul's third missionary journey and imprisonment. As was the pattern, it was during some of Paul's most difficult times, such as imprisonment, when God used him most profoundly. But I'm sure it didn't feel like happy days to him. Much of this portion of Acts describes Paul's journey to churches he's already established. As usual, his experiences are a mix of miracles and troubles, but eventually he's arrested. Most scholars agree that Paul is imprisoned for 2 extended periods of time. It's during those incarcerations that Paul writes letters to churches and to his mentors. Those letters are later canonized and made part of the New Testament. Once again, showing that God uses difficult situations to produce wonderful things. It's during one of those imprisonments that God gives Paul the opportunity to give his testimony to dignitaries. Robert Deffinbaugh describes the account from Acts 26 like this, quote, "What a scene it must have been with Paul standing before the august gathering of celebrities and leaders, they having arrived and seated themselves with all due dignity and solemnity, he in his chains, accompanied no doubt by one or more guards. It was not to be as dramatic as in days to come when the Romans would watch the Christians be devoured by the lions, but some of the same spirit may have prevailed. After all, this gathering was at best a matter of curiosity to those who attended. So it seems to have been for Agrippa, Paul was hardly to be taken seriously, nor did anyone come hoping or expecting to be converted. But perhaps hearing Paul would at least help them to understand the mindset of Judaism and thus some of the cause for all the uprisings and disorder for which they were constantly fomenting. For some men, this hearing would have dazzled them, standing before such a large gathering of shakers and movers of that day. Some might have entered into this occasion with apprehension, perhaps contemplating how to make the gospel more tolerable to such pagans as were gathered. For Paul, it was just one more of a long sequence of hearings where his conduct, his ministry, and his gospel were scrutinized by public officials for some sign of wrongdoing. End quote. The dignitaries Paul speaks to are impressed, and many even come close to believing, but they do not release him. It's believed that he's taken to Rome, where Nero has him beheaded. But it's on record that God gave even the kings and emperors of the Roman Empire their opportunities to believe. What are your thoughts about this? I'd like to end this session and this series with a bit of a twist. In this series, we've talked about how God gives opportunities, about how God uses us to give others opportunities, about how people often reject opportunities God and his people offer, and about how God might even use you and I to give opportunities to the rich and the famous. But before you share your experiences with the rich and famous, I'd like to point out that God gave some nobodies opportunities, and when they took them, he made them rich and famous. When I say the names Abraham, Moses, Peter, and Paul, people all over the world from many cultures and religions know immediately who I'm talking about. These men, along with Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, David, and other Bible heroes, have been used of God to change the world. With only a few exceptions, these men came from humble beginnings. When compared to those who have run the world empires or vast corporations, these men don't measure up. But when compared to those who have truly impacted the world and eternity forever, these men outshine them all. I'm sure when God gives rewards in heaven, these people will be shocked at the impact that they've had. But it will also be clear that these men changed the world because they were wholly given to God. You and I may be shocked at how God has and will use our humble efforts to change the world and to impact eternal souls. That's why we need to be so careful not to be distracted by smaller endeavors. That's why we must not be intimidated by carnally minded people. That's why we can live in joy and anticipation. Apostolic believers have been given salvation as well as the power and privilege to work under the influence of the Holy Spirit to give everyone in the world their greatest opportunities. Will you settle for less than this great honor? Or will you believe that God can take your humble life and use it for His great purposes? Would you be willing to believe that God will blow your mind in this last end-time harvest? I hope this series has helped you see how God has given you amazing opportunities. I hope you can see how that you are privileged to help others find those same opportunities for themselves. Why don't we close this series by sharing our faith and thanking God for our high calling?